Welcome back to the Religious Treehouse. I'm Jody.
And I'm Matthew.
How are you today, Matthew?
I'm doing good. Baseball's back, so I can't complain. Love a good baseball game. So
And who
I'm
are we
I'm
cheering
excited.
for?
What was that?
Who are we cheering for?
See, I would normally say the Braves, but at the time of this recording, it's kind of embarrassing to be a Braves fan. So hopefully by the time this is out, the Braves will be doing just so good, and it'll be the talk of the town. Like, oh my goodness, the Braves are the best team in baseball after their rough start. But go Braves, right?
It's so nice to have dreams.
How are you doing, Jody?
I'm doing phenomenal. It's cloudy outside, which puts a grin on my face.
Yeah, no, love a good cloudy weather.
Yes. I like it when it's dreary.
Oh yeah, but maybe not covered in darkness, in complete utter darkness. Maybe that would just be a little too dark, a little too dreary.
I mean, I think that would be almost plague-like.
I think you might be right. And that's what we're talking about today. The plagues in Egypt. Well, at least the first nine. We're going to save the final plague, Passover, the killing of the firstborn, for a later episode. But I'm excited for this discussion. How are you feeling about it?
I am so excited. I really just think each of these plagues is artistry.
Yeah,
They happened for a reason. There was an intent behind them and they accomplished what they set out to do.
yeah. I suppose so. But yeah, there. This is such a loaded story. Like, there's so much going on. Like in these plagues. I guess we can call them plagues. Well, I'll talk about that later. But I think this is going to turn into what we're planning to do with Esther, where we can just return to it periodically because there's so much that we can like talk about with these. So I'm looking forward to it and our future episodes, and we'll have to do a future episode on plague number 10 for sure, but that deserves its own episode.
Mhm.
But yeah, do you want to give us a very brief summary real quick?
Oh, you know I do. Okay. So Moses and Aaron have met up by this point, and they have both been bequeathed a task from the Lord. And Aaron has to go and perform, well, no, God tells Moses, who tells Aaron to go perform things and make things happen. But God does warn them Pharaoh's heart is going to be hardened. It's going to be difficult. And we get through 9 plagues. The first plague, water turned to blood. Second, frogs. Then we have gnats, flies, livestock being diseased, boils, thunder and hail, locusts, and darkness. And then we get to plague 10, and there's sorcerers, wise men, and magician all along the way. It's fantastical.
Yeah, maybe not all along the way, but we'll talk about that in this episode, I'm sure. But no, great summary. I'm excited to get into this. This is Exodus 7 through 10, essentially. So we'll start there with the first part of Exodus 7. It's kind
Mhm.
of introducing the scene, right? Where
Yeah.
Pharaoh's talking to Moses and God tells Moses to talk with him. So then the Lord, Adonai says, we're going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And throughout the story, we get, back and forth. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart. So we get both. Yeah.
Is it back and forth, or is there like a transition from where it's like
Um,
the first 5 is Pharaoh, the last 5 is God?
if I remember correctly, it's for the most part the beginning is Pharaoh and the last part is God, more so at least. But I think it's somewhat intermixed. But we get both. And sometimes it's hard to count these numbers. I think some that I've heard say it's 10 and 10, 10 Pharaoh hardening his own heart, 10 God hardening Pharaoh's heart. I've seen like 7 and 8 and stuff like that. Well, as we'll get into, numbering these things can be a little complicated, as it always is when there's just not a given list and we have to make the list on our own. But we have 10 plagues here for the most part, right? So that's what it's known for.
Okay, before we get into that, I have a question about the significance of Moses being compared to God and Aaron to a prophet in verse 1 of
Mhm.
chapter 7.
Yeah, so well, Aaron is the prophet means like speak on behalf of someone. So, prophet what we might commonly think of, and I'm sure we talk about this when we talk about prophets. Have we only had one episode on prophets, Jonah?
Yes.
Oh my goodness, we need to talk more about prophets.
Well, we're
Um,
doing it now.
but in common culture, when we hear prophet, we often think of like future telling and stuff like that, and that's not necessarily what's going on. It to be a prophet means to speak on behalf of one another. So a prophet is kind of an intermediary between the people and God. So that's what Aaron is doing here. He's being an intermediary between Moses and Pharaoh.
So a spokesperson.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. I think that's a good analogy.
Okay.
So
So,
that's the role that Aaron plays for the most part. Uh, Aaron is known as being as the head of the priestly line, and Moses and Aaron are both kind of given prophetic roles.
okay, but why do we need what why both of them is my question. Why both?
Why?
Porquedos. Like
Why
why
both?
both of these guys? One's getting the message, the other is giving it, and Moses is just a glorified telephone.
Yeah, I think this is explained. I think we talked about this in our last Exodus episode, where Moses can no speak no well, as I think I would translate it. I Moses, I can't no speak. Me speak good? No. Me Moses, no speak good.
Cut
So
out the middleman.
the idea is that, or the rationale is that Moses can't speak eloquently, or he might have a speaking disability. So, like disability studies, or reading this through the lens of 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 disability, can look at Moses as seeing how God uses a prophet who isn't, standard, however you might want to define that. So, and this also might be, we might see Pharaoh as being perhaps not of, perfect standard body, as his heart often gets hardened. So that's another way that this can be read. So the rationale is that Moses can't speak well. He doesn't speak eloquently. He might have a lisp. He might, have some, he might get real nervous speaking in public. So that's why we have Aaron. Moses talks to Aaron, and Aaron talks to people.
Okay. I vibe with that. I like that. That's a
Yeah.
good explanation that I will accept.
Yeah.
If you had told me we just need both of them, I would have been like, why? But no,
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. Okay. Now I'm ready to move on to the plagues.
Perfect. Well, before we get to the plagues per se, is we get the Aaron's staff turning into a snake.
Ah, yes, Aaron's miraculous rod,
Yeah,
as
that's
my Bible has it titled.
no this, and again, I go into my rant about how Bibles shouldn't have headings on things that aren't there. It's just these random inserts of titles. I don't like that. It bugs me. My biggest problem with NRSV.
Someone
Well,
give this to Andrew Lloyd Webber, okay? This is the new Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Aaron and his miraculous rod. I see a stage show, national tour.
yeah,
It'd be
well, they've done musicals about this, haven't they? Isn't um what's the one kids movie that you always want me to watch that I've never seen?
Prince of Egypt, but it's not
Yeah.
a stage show.
Yeah, but it's a musical. They do songs and stuff.
Okay, but a stage show and a musical are very different. Like they can be. Like a musical can be a stage show, but a I'm not getting into the specifics of this
Oh,
movie right now.
there's one with Val Kilmer called The Ten Commandments, and he passed away like a day or two ago at the time of this recording, which is real sad. But Val Kilmer has a Ten Commandments musical that I cannot find anywhere online for sale or anywhere, and I desperately want to see it because like it just doesn't feel right, like having all that together. So anyway, this is a detour.
Did you look up slime tutorial like I told you to?
No, I can't even like find, like it's on IMDb. Like IMDb acknowledges that it exists, but like nowhere on Google even acknowledges its existence.
That's wild. Okay,
Maybe I just
we'll do
haven't tried hard
research.
enough. Hey, if anyone has seen Val Kilmer's Ten Commandments the musical, send it to us because we want to see it. But this
And
is this
now
is
Now I want a Prince of Egypt stage show, so thanks.
um, but yeah, where were we? Aaron's staff.
Mhm.
So what we have here is perhaps the first plague, if we want to say that. Um, I don't think I don't think most people. Okay, so the thing with plagues is that there's multiple ways that we refer to this. There's It's referred to as plagues, but it's also referred to as signs or wonders.
Yep.
So like these are sometimes referred to as the 10 signs, the 10 wonders. For some reason in English we said plagues. Plagues is more fun. So we refer to this as the 10 plagues. Because I think there's only one plague, one like for sure plague in the 10 plagues. The diseased livestock.
When did we start using the word plagues?
I have no idea.
That'd be interesting.
Probably after, the Black Death and
That's what I'm
the
thinking.
I don't know. I have no idea.
You're not
But
going to go
it's become
check?
popular. In English, when we talk about the 10 plagues, we know the 10 plagues. We talk about the 10 signs, 10 wonders, like we might know what we're talking about. But the 10 plagues is like cemented into the minds of English, at least in English.
Yeah.
So, like, this could be another potential sign that we can look at. And so, what's happening here is Aaron gets his staff and he throws it on the ground and it turns into a snake. And then the Egyptian sorcerers, do we want to go with sorcerers or magicians? What sounds more fun for this conversation?
Magicians.
Magicians. And the Egypt magicians go along and do their thing and they say, look, we can do it too. But Aaron, his staff eats all, or his snake eats all of the other snakes because his snake is better than the other serpents.
And this again supports my thought that the serpent in the garden was more connected to God and not connected to the devil. Because why is another sign of God coming through as a serpent?
Okay, so I think if I remember correctly, we have, oh my goodness, I don't want to get this wrong, but we have three different words for snake that we're using here. And I think in Genesis 3 that you're referring to, that snake, I think that's a seraph. I think that's that kind of snake. And that's not the snake that we're talking about here. What we have, there's another word. No, nakash. Nakash is the word for snake in Genesis 3. I don't know what I was thinking. Ignore that. But nakash, I might not be pronouncing it right. It's lost my brain right now. That's the snake in Genesis 3. But what we get in Genesis 1 with the sea monsters, the sea creatures, you remember that from Genesis
Yeah.
1?
Mm.
We have the word tanin. When that's the word that's used here, these are tananim that are being created here. These are sea monsters, dragons that we might want to think about from our Bell and the Dragon episode, probably have that similar connotation. So what I think it's much more accurate to think of this as Aaron's staff turning into a dragon and all of the magician staffs also turning into dragons. And then you're in this big room with a bunch of different dragons attacking each other. It's a much bigger scene than just, little snakes being thrown down.
And then Aaron's dragon eats all of the other dragons.
Yeah,
Wow. That is a miraculous rod Aaron has.
right. No, for sure. And that's the point. This is kind of Aaron saying, like, look, my God is better than your gods and doing your thing. So can we get into the first plague official
Yes, we
as
can.
we like to number it? I think there's two or three things that we should be paying attention to here.
Mm.
As this brief introduction, we have. I mean, there's so many things to talk about here, and we're gonna go long, so hopefully we don't go too long. But I think that we can look at these plagues as deconstruction, levels of deconstruction happening. Uh, so I think there's some tight connections between Genesis 1 and this story, and we can kind of see reversals of creation happening. So we'll be looking at for that throughout. We can also be looking at how this correlates to Egyptian mythology and how Egyptians view their gods, and how this can be kind of seen as a divine war between uh, the God of Moses versus the gods of the Egyptians. So that's another thing we might want to look at. And also, we can kind of maybe look at source criticism and how different sources were kind of intertwined in these to kind of talk through their own unique tellings of the story. So I think those are the three things I want to focus on as we go through this, and hopefully that will all make sense. And it might be easier to just talk about each one individually at the end, but we'll
Yeah.
see how this conversation goes.
Yep. You and I each have our own rubrics of what we're looking at.
Fantastic. But yeah, so the first plague is we get water into blood, and primarily the Nile. So the Nile is, the life source of Egypt. It's kind of like why Egypt exists. It's why Egypt is a thing. And it's because it's the water, it's their water source. So all of the water turns to blood. And we even get, the barrels and pools. And the word for pools, and this is referring to the NRSV, um, the word translated as pools is the same word that refers back to Genesis 1, talking about the waters there. So, and that's kind of our first inclination that this is kind of referring back to Genesis 1 and reversing creation. Well, I guess Aaron's rod would be the first inclination, referring back to Genesis 1 with the Tananim. But I think, and then at the very end, we get the last verse, what is it, 25? 7 days passed after the Lord struck the Nile. So the Nile is bloody for 7 days. And I think we really get a view that the authors, or at least one of the authors, is attempting to draw this back to the Genesis 1 narrative to some extent. And we'll see this throughout.
Yeah. And no, thinking about it, the Nile, that's such a massive like geographic thing. And I'm not too hip on what people in this time prided themselves on, but I think to write that you were going to turn someone's entire like river into blood is
Mm-hmm.
like kind of a slam dunk on them. Like
Yeah.
not only are we taking away your water source, but the Nile River is known for being just beautiful. There's still Nile River cruises. Like
Mm-hmm.
based off what we modernly how we view the Nile River, that's a big thing. So like they just start with a home run. They're just like, we're gonna turn the Nile into blood.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's the life source of Egypt, and like the Egyptian god Happy, Happy, to quote Joseph from Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. I don't speak Egyptian very well, so the Egyptian god Happy is what we're going with. Is the deity of the Nile. So this first plague is showing God, the God of Moses's triumph over this life source of Egypt as a very prominent deity that gives so much life and strength to the Egyptians. So I think that's what's happening with number one here.
Yeah. And then going back to like the Genesis thing, like the life-giving, like water gives life.
Mm,
Water, water births. I mean, Moses himself was technically birthed from the Nile. So to pull it
mm.
back to like where Moses was pulled from.
Yeah, no, for sure. And this happens in the first, fourth, and seventh plague, where these plagues are kind of ordered in groups of three, um, 1, 2, and 3, with 4, 5, and 6, and 7, 8, 9. That seems to be the tight narrative structure that I see. And 4, 7, or 1, 4, and 7 all start with in the morning. Like it happens in the morning. That's kind of how we are able to see each section differentiates itself. And it also talks about how Pharaoh goes down to the river in 1, 4, and 7. Maybe not 7, but at least in 1 and 4. And I think it's supposed to harken back to Genesis 1, not Genesis 1, Exodus 1, where Moses is put in the river. And there's so much happening with the river that is caught up in this entire narrative. And all of the plagues in plagues 1, 2, and 3 are related to the Nile in some way. We get the blood in the water, we get the frogs coming from the Nile, and we get the gnats. All of these are associated with the water in some extent. So there's definitely a correlation between the Nile, especially in these first three plagues.
I also like it makes you wonder about the insinuation of God attacking those things that like are such big parts of the beginning, like or just this one thing that's such a big part of Moses's beginning in this story, like kind of severing that tie. Like the tie's
Mhm.
already been severed when Moses was chased out, but then adding on the layer of Moses's true beginning in this story being the vessel for the first three plagues. It
Mhm.
seems a little heavier than I always thought it to be.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Okay. And that's plague one. And but
Right.
and then it says they dug alongside the Nile for water to drink, and I'm in my head I'm imagining them digging holes and there still being blood.
Yeah, no, it's unclear how they quenched their thirst for these first few for the first 7 days, but obviously it took some oomph from them.
Yeah.
Also, what I don't understand, this is me saying, "Hey, Bible, this doesn't make sense," and maybe I can like do some research and figure this out. Moses turned all the water to blood, right?
Yeah.
And then the Egyptian magicians, that kind of has a nice little rhyme to it. Egyptian magician.
Mhm.
The Egyptian magicians could also do that. They also could turn the all the water into blood. So if they could do that, what water wasn't already blood, and what water were they wasting by turning it into blood? So
Yeah.
I think that's silly.
Yeah, no. That one doesn't make much sense. But
Oh
it's this first one, Pharaoh does not take this to heart. Oh no, it remained hardened, but he did
yeah,
not take it to heart. So I just want to know for
yeah,
ourselves.
perfect. And then we move into the second plague of frogs. Yes, and this kind of goes back to what you were talking about with fertility of the Nile. I think this is kind of what's happening here with the frogs too, because the Egyptian goddess Heket, something like that. I don't know. Is the goddess of fertility and childbirth, and she's often depicted with a frog head. So it kind of starts off with a 1-2 punch against the Nile and against their source of water and their source of fertility of two very very important things for existence of the culture of a society that Moses' God is able to take out right away.
So this is just like an Egyptian diss track, is the vibe I'm getting from just these first two plagues.
Yeah, I mean it's so much of the Bible as we've seen is a distract towards someone because it's always about because so much of the Bible story, the story of the Israelites, is that they're oppressed by some group. It's the Egyptians here that are oppressing them. Later, it'll be the Babylonians and then the Persians. And there's just always there's some group oppressing the Israelites. So to create meaning, to create purpose, to come to terms with it, you're going to write text against that to create this sense of unity with your in crowd that looks at the other, that looks at them, and says, okay, we need some comfort against that.
And they really went hard on this one. They had frogs coming out of going into ovens and kneading
Yeah.
bowls.
Yeah. Frogs
Like
were everywhere.
forms of sustenance were just completely cut off.
Mm-hmm.
And then the frogs died and they stank up the entire place.
Yeah. Yeah. And we get another throwback to Genesis 1. We get the swarms of frogs, and the idea of swarming creatures is very common or repeated itself in Genesis 1. So we get that again. But yeah, and again, the magicians could do it. The magicians are like, yeah, easy, no problem whatsoever.
And Pharaoh hardened his heart.
And Pharaoh hardened his heart. Perfect. So, plague three?
Yeah, and then in an unfortunate twist, then we have gnats. After the frogs are gone,
Yeah.
we have gnats as the third plague. I really think the ordering of these, I just wonder if someone had a storyboard and was like throwing up like ideas for like the different signs, and they were like, what way can we order this to make it hit harder? Because you know what, at least if the frogs had been after the gnats and the flies, they could have done some cleanup there.
Sure, sure.
Sorry, but yes, the next plague, gnats.
Yeah, the next plague, gnats. And the most interesting thing here, I I think, is that the magicians weren't able to produce the gnats, which is funny that they could make water into blood, they could make the frogs, but they couldn't produce the gnats. And there's some traditions say that the gnats are too small and that God can only create super, super, super small things because gnats are tiny things. And so they're just too small to be under the control of Egyptians, and only God can make those things. So yeah, I don't have too much else to say about those. I didn't look into all of the Egyptian references here, just a couple of them. But I think
Um,
there's a general idea of a conversation against the Egyptian pantheon.
but this one, Pharaoh's heart was hardened.
Yep, as it
And then
happens.
we go into the fourth plague, flies, which are just
Flies.
bigger gnats.
Yeah, so this is a complicated word to translate. It only shows up in this story, if I remember correctly, maybe once in like First Samuel, but it's
So
referring back to this story.
it's a uh onomatopoeia, hagamana, lamina.
You're thinking of Hapex legomena,
Yep.
which is close,
Dang.
but Hapex legomena usually only appears once. It appears a handful of times, but it
Okay.
only appears in relation to this story. Yeah. So because we don't have like a variety of ways to understand this, it's kind of hard to translate it. It seems to resemble the word locust that we see later in a later plague. And I think it's also mentioned in some Psalms. Um, so we think flies fits the narrative best, but some think that it might be animals of some sort uh, because they kind of cover the land or they destroy the land. So the idea that there's swarming flies that fill and destroy the land again, kind of harkening back to Genesis 1 that fill the land and stuff like that. So it may be some sort of animal type thing, but I think fly is the best way to translate it.
Now I'm seeing horse flies. Those are
Yeah.
huge and a nuisance.
Yeah.
So it filled up the entire land, and there was a distinction made between my people and your people, according to Moses.
Mhm.
Or
Yeah, so the this is starting the second section. Um, one, two, and we have 1, 2, and 3 together, 4, 5, 6 together, and so we have Pharaoh going back down to the river, Moses talking to him there in the morning, and starting this new section here. And in this section, what's kind of unique is that the plagues tend to only affect the Egyptians. So, like, whereas the first plague kind of got everyone, these plagues seem only directed towards the Egyptians.
so our God is so big and bad that our dragon ate your dragon and he turned your water into blood and infested you with frogs and gnats and flies, and now he's making it only happen to the Egyptians.
Yeah, no, that seems to be what is happening here. And then we get
Phenomenal.
Pharaoh hardening his own heart again.
Just open your heart, Pharaoh. It's okay. Just let his people go.
Perfect. So fifth plague, we ready?
Yes.
Cool.
We have diseased livestock now. And I gotta say, I don't like taking care of myself when I'm sick. So for livestock to be diseased, and in this day and age, they didn't have like vaccinations or anything.
No.
They just had sick, dying animals. Like that is a big mess to clean up.
Yeah.
Shark them.
The Egyptian animals, though.
Just the Egyptian.
Just the Egyptian animals.
I gotta say, someone should have called PETA on them because we really shouldn't bring animals into our blood feuds.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think PETA would have a problem with most of these plagues. But hey, PETA has no authority over the Bible.
Nope,
I don't think, at least. I don't think PETA claims that.
not yet.
um,
So, oh, and this is the section that has that verse I told you I really like, and then Matthew showed me there's better verses. But Exodus 9:5 says, the Lord set a time saying, tomorrow the Lord will do this thing in the land. And I love how non-specific it is. This thing.
Yeah, okay, but that's the verse that is referring back to Genesis 1. Because remember in Genesis 1, uh, God distinguishes between night and day and he separates appointed times for things. So again, with this, we're showing how there's a state of decreation happening. That seems to be the theme of these. And he's harkening back to Genesis 1, where it's calling back to the time of separated times and stuff like that.
Oh my gosh. And the decreation that's happening in this one is the animals on the earth.
Yeah.
Okay. What was it with the frogs?
The frogs, the swarming frogs, the creeping, crawling, swarming frogs, it seemed to refer back to Genesis 1 through that.
But but what were the frogs decreating?
I mean, they just kind of covered everything and were a
Hmm.
general big nuisance.
And the flies and the gnats?
Same thing, I guess. The idea of God kind of reversing creation instead of creating things, these things are causing problems and doing bad things. And I
Okay.
think they're being plagues instead of being, gifts and good things. And I think that's kind of the reversal that's happening here.
Okay. I just think it's easier for me to see in the livestock one.
Mm.
But again, Pharaoh's heart was hardened.
Pharaoh's heart was hardened.
All of the Egyptians' livestock died, but none of the Israelites' livestock died.
Woo!
So, where are you going to get your protein now?
Yeah.
And then we have, are we good for the next plague?
Yeah.
Boils.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever had a boil?
Not, I don't think so.
They're very unpleasant. It's not fun. Like I take this one personally.
I had a
And
really bad sunburn once that kind of had a boil. So different.
I
It's a
think
different
that's
thing.
I don't
It's
think
a
that's what these people were experiencing.
no.
I think what they experienced was terrible. And it was on animals and humans, festering boils. Ugh. And the magicians are back. They could not stand before Moses because of the boils, because
Mm,
they afflicted the magicians as well as all the Egyptians.
right.
But this is the first time the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart.
With the boils.
Mhm.
Yeah, I swear it was in chapter 7 too. But I could be just so wrong. Yeah, no. Pharaoh's heart was hardened and he said he would not. Yeah. So like we get reference to Lord hardening hearts, but not in this narrative section yet. It doesn't seem like. So yeah, you're right.
So
But we get the Egyptians again. So the Egyptians weren't with the plagues or weren't with the flies or the livestock, remember? So we get the magicians coming back, and this is the last time the magicians are mentioned. And the magicians are even received the boils.
So this is like the ultimate slam dunk, like, oh, you remember those magicians from earlier? Oh, they have boils too, and you're never going to see them again because they could not do the things that the Lord was making happen.
Yeah,
And then we get the next plague.
right. And this is when the plagues really ramp up. They're much longer sections. Not much longer, but they are heftier little bits that talk about. And we get thunder and hail. This one's one of my favorites. It's exciting. There's a lot going on because it's not only thunder and hail happening, it's fire. There's fire falling to the ground, which is, again, just this beautiful, vivid imagery that's happening where, there's just a lot of destruction happening. But Moses goes to Pharaoh to threaten him and his officials, saying, like, I could have killed you, but like you've seen all these things that we could do. I could have killed you, but I'm going to let you live to see all of God's power and stuff like that. So he's like, hail's going to fall, and some of the officials are like, okay, I believe you now. So they take cover, but everyone who didn't take cover and all of their livestock uh, are now dead.
It's so disappointing because you can kind of tell in Plague 6, like especially because the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, that like
Mm,
Pharaoh, like when it was really affecting like people, it seemed like he maybe would have wanted to like let them go. And then you get to the seventh plague and like people are being affected again, but because of the fact that his heart was hardened by the Lord in the previous plague, his heart is then hardened again by himself in the seventh plague. And you don't know what could have been.
I think the idea here, at least generally understood, is that we really want to show God's power. We really want to highlight God's power in contrast to the Egyptian power. So what we're going to do is we're going to let these plagues go on so that we can really highlight God's power.
I guess like it's driving the plot forward, but
Mhm.
it seems very intense, man.
Yeah, I think that's the point. I think it's trying to be very intense.
Why can't we all get along and skip and sniff the roses?
Sure, sure. But sometimes, such as, when an entire people group is enslaved, sometimes you have to be a little extreme to fix that.
Thought you told me that that didn't actually happen.
Yeah, I don't think there's much historical basis to these plagues either.
I don't know. Maybe can we see any ecological effects after the fact?
I none that I know of, but who could say?
Could say. But yeah,
Oh
no, this is honestly, this is a really good plague.
no,
This is
it's
just
it's
like
a
really bad weather.
right, really bad weather, except in Goshen where the Israelites were. The Israelites again still fine. Oh, and all of the trees and plants are hit and destroyed except for wheat. Wheat is fine because we need something for the locusts to attack next plague.
That's so sick.
Yeah.
That's sick, man. Like we're gonna leave your weed alone because we have better plans for that.
So yeah, no, we get into the eighth plague with the locusts, uh,
Oh,
and and Moses and Pharaoh says, "Okay, fine, fine, Moses, fine. I'll let all your men go. We'll let all your men go. All your men can go free, but all your women and children and livestock, they'll stay here." And Moses is like, "No, that's not the deal. That ain't gonna happen." So Moses again stretches out his hand, and stretching out his hand is kind of an idiom for cursing something.
oh,
So, right, let me check my notes to make sure I got that right. Yeah, yeah. So stretching out his hand is kind of like an idiom for causing harm. So that's kind of why there's so much arm stretching happening throughout this story. Like, we're gonna cause some harm, and I'm gonna do that by stretching my arm.
I agree. It's a visual, a very nice visual, because I just imagine him stretching out his arm and then coming up from behind him is just swarms of
Yeah,
locusts descending upon all of Egypt, except
all
for
of
Goshen.
Egypt. Yeah, is Goshen mentioned in this one, or is it just kind of
Mm,
assumed at this point?
I don't see Goshen in here.
Yeah, I think that was just the thunder and hail. But at this point, the locusts destroy everything. They destroy all the greeneries of all the trees. Again, remember Genesis 1, all the trees and plants and greenery things being created, now being very clearly destroyed. And it's sad. You know how I feel about trees. We're getting rid of all the trees here now. All the trees have been fine for the most part. Maybe they had to like drink a little bloody water to like sustain their roots and whatnot, but they've been fairly fine up until now, which is real sad. I love a good tree.
Well, they were kind of shattered during the hail.
Yeah, yeah.
So
But I
they
think
are.
I think the locusts really take care of whatever's left.
It keeps saying that there's a festival they're trying to get to. Do you know what festival they're talking about? Like,
A
they talk about
what
the
verse?
Lord's Festival.
What verse? Do you know what your
10:9. We have the Lord's Festival to celebrate.
Moses said, "We will go with our young and old, and we will go with our sons and daughters, and with our flocks and herds, because we have the Lord's festival to celebrate." I am not sure what explicit festival they're referring to. Let me check these notes. Um, so it seems to be a pilgrimage of some sort. I think essentially the point that they're trying to make is we need to do these things for our God. So let us go because we can't do it here and we need to go celebrate and do our own thing. I think it's kind of like hey, we need to worship our God in freedom and not in slavery. That might be what it's referring to. I don't know. I don't think it's referring to a specific festival. I could be wrong. Yeah, well, I mean, like
No,
Passover
you're right.
happens.
You're right. Because in 8:26 through 28, I made a note and I forgot to talk about it.
Mhm.
Is they were saying that they couldn't do anything because that would be the Egyptians wouldn't like seeing that.
Yeah.
And so I was just wondering if there was a specific festival, but yes, they did have to go into the wilderness. And here is my note from that. See, now if all people were tolerant of other people's religions, we wouldn't have to take a 3-day trek into the wilderness to sacrifice to our God in order to stop the plagues.
Yeah.
Also, probably wouldn't have plagues.
Yeah, well, I think that might have been a little more Moses saying, hey, just give us 3 days to go off into the wilderness and do our own thing. Just give us 3 days. And that may have just been Moses trying to get out of there and maybe not come back after 3 days. But who's to know?
But I thought thou shalt not lie.
Oh, there's plenty of lying. God lies.
So they are trying to get out for the festival. The whole land is covered, and the land was blackened. All the plants. That's so sad. All
Yeah.
the plants.
Uh,
But they get driven out into the Red Sea, the
well, that's
locusts.
late. That's oh yeah, yeah. God brings a wind around to move them away. Um, this is after Pharaoh was like, "Okay, I was wrong. I sinned. This was bad. I'm sorry." Uh, and
I mean,
then and then God hardened Pharaoh's heart again, and Pharaoh said, "No, you can't go. You can't go. Tricked
but what
you."
if he hadn't hardened Pharaoh's heart that time?
Then it
God's
would
kind
be
of working against them.
then it would be a boring story with 8 plagues. What is eight? What fun is 8 plagues?
So much. 8 on its side is the infinity symbol.
I don't think I don't. First of all, the number 8 in Arabic numerals, I don't think was around yet. And second of all, I don't think infinity was had been invented yet. I could be wrong. I don't know my history of math very well, but my guess is that the concept of infinity is a fairly recent. Well, maybe not recent, but I think it's a little bit newer than this. When was infinity invented? 1655. That doesn't
Now,
seem right.
was it invented or discovered?
The earliest recorded idea of infinity in Greece may be that of Alexander from around 600 BCE. This is according to Wikipedia, not a trustworthy source, but it's all we have in this very brief research session that we had. Which again, I think this is just beside the point. This has nothing to do with infinity. You got me on a tangent that has nothing to do with this, Jody. Come on.
How was that trip down that tangent?
Okay, Infinity. This has nothing to do with Infinity. We're back on Locust. Locust happened. Pharaoh's heart is hardened. We're moving on to the ninth and final plague that we're talking about today. Darkness. Has nothing to do with
Darkness.
Infinity.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
This time, Pharaoh gets no warning. I think that's generally how it happens on the third, sixth, and ninth. I could be getting that wrong, but there's like no warning or anything for Pharaoh. It just kind of happens. Uh, so Moses is told to stretch out his hand over Egypt, and as everything's dark for the Egyptians, but not the Israelites. The Israelites can see fine. Pharaoh says Moses that they can go, but not your livestock. And Moses says, nah, we need our livestock. So God hardens Pharaoh's heart again and would not let them go. And then interestingly here, we have the same verbiage as the beginning of Genesis, let there be light, but we have God saying, let there be darkness, which I think is very evident case of decreation happening that's coming back on Genesis 1.
Yeah. People could not see one another, and for 3 days they could not move from where they were. But
Yeah.
all the Israelites had light where they lived. Our God is so good.
Mhm.
He made darkness for all of you. Like they could have also just made everyone blind.
Yeah, which I mean is essentially what's happening here, but in effect, everyone is blind, but in reality, in the tell of the story, everything's just real dark.
But if the Israelites had light where they lived, why did they not just use this moment to escape?
Listen,
And
I don't
the Egyptians couldn't move for 3 days.
know. Pharaoh said no,
They're
and Moses said okay.
listening to a man? Come on now.
Yeah. Oh, notably, I think this one is kind of doing another punch towards the Egyptian deities, primarily Ra, the Egyptian sun god. Uh, and this is kind of blotting out the sun, creating complete darkness. Because Ra is the main god from Egypt for some extent. To some extent, I think Osiris has something to say too, which I think Osiris is addressed in the final plague that we're not going to really talk about today. So this is God really showing dominance over the high deity of the Egyptian pantheon with overpowering the sun and light.
So just one massive Egyptian diss track, one banger after another, with
Yeah.
each plague, sign, or wonder, however you want to phrase it, with God along the journey hardening the heart of Pharaoh when he could be helping his people out.
Right. And I should go on this tangent on the hardening of heart. There's this idea, I think this was proposed by Sarah Ben Rubens. I could be wrong there. But I think she kind of proposes that so the word for harden that we see in the Bible has two different words. There's kavod and there's hazak. Kavod kind of means weighty, and hazak means like stiffen. So I think, and I think this is very fascinating. One of my favorite interpretations of this. I don't know if it's accurate, but I think it's. I don't know how widely accepted this is. I know there is people that disagree with it, but the idea of a heavy heart being, harden may not be the best translation. Heavy in some cases might be a better translation. Would have some particular weight in the Egyptian context. In the Egyptian view of the afterlife, when a person dies, they're often brought to Anubis, where they would announce innocence of their crimes. They would recite a bunch of things saying like, "Hey, we're innocent," and their heart would be placed on a scale opposite of Ma'at. And that kind of Ma'at is kind of like the representation of truth and justice and social order. And it's often pictured as like a feather or a goddess wearing a feather. So it's a heart weighed against a feather. And if the heart is lighter than the feather, they were deemed righteous and they were allowed into the afterlife. If they, weren't, if they told the truth and did all those good things, they were cast into the afterlife. But if their heart was heavy, they would be eaten by a monster and cast into oblivion. So the idea of heaviness of heart is tied to this idea of guilt and wrongness and doing bad and lying and stuff like that. So this might be an idiom used by the Israelite author who might be aware of this Egyptian idiom to kind of explain how Pharaoh is being uh, guilty and doing bad things, and that's what's happening with the hardening of the heart. And I haven't looked much into this yet. I also think the redactor that kind of combined these stories together may not have known of that idiom, and they explained that away as that's why God hardens Pharaoh's heart because the person who redacted this wasn't quite aware of that idiom. I don't know if I take too much. I'll have to do more research to confirm that, but it is something that people have considered and rationalized for why God would harden Pharaoh's heart.
I mean, he could have also just been fully aware and made a decision to have a deity purposefully harden a heart to cast that soul into a dark place in the afterlife, you know, like
Mm,
in a very vengeful, dark way. Because that's like, yes, that's also like a big flex of like, oh, that our God is going to make sure like you're not going to be able to get to your happy afterlife, is
yeah.
going to curse you and purposefully has an agenda against and like will use your own theologies against you. Not that they had the theology word, but you get what
Mm,
I'm saying.
yeah.
It's a very darker, more vengeful God in this story, at least in this section, to me.
Yeah, I think the idea that they're trying to present is a powerful God, not so much a vengeful God. Oh, I think that the message that is being written here is that our God has power to do these things.
Okay. And do you think it just got all messed up with all the different sources? That's right. Let's talk sources. How many
Yeah.
sources, Matthew?
Yeah. So this one's really complicated and trying to figure out how the sources are here. So what's evident, and if you remember our last Exodus episode when I ranted about sources, which is what's going to happen now, is it's fairly evident that the P source is here. The priestly source is intermixed throughout this.
Well, yeah, because Moses and Aaron are from the priestly line. So the
Well,
priestly
yeah,
source is going to be all up in this one.
yeah, no, I mean the priestly source is it's likely the latest of you know. So the documentary hypothesis proposes J, E, P, and D. J and E are going to be the earliest. P is going to be later, and D is the Deuteronomy source. And as I mentioned last time, there are different ways to understand uh, this the source criticism, which I think is much more relevant. But for the sake of this conversation, we're going to keep it simple with J, E, P, and D, which we'll miss out on a little bit, but that's okay for this conversation. So what we have is P being a later source. So what likely happened is that the P source kind of added J and E and other sources around it and kind of used P as the primary document, which is why it's so prominent throughout Genesis and Exodus and Numbers, and it is essentially the entirety of Leviticus. But so we're pretty sure P is part of this, and then I've seen some sources say that J is intermixed within this. Richard Elliott Friedman thinks it's E that's intermixed within this. So what I can feel confident saying is that we have J or not J, we have P intermixed with non-P, and what seems to be and as proposed by Richard Elliott Friedman, the P source seems to be presenting itself as a duel between Moses and the magicians. And so we see Moses and the Egyptians happen in blood, frog, gnats, boils, and the death of the firstborn. The magicians aren't in the death of the firstborn, but we think those are the pre sources. That's what the P source talks about. So with the blood of the frogs, the magicians could do that, and it was fine. With the gnats, the magicians couldn't reproduce that, and with the boils, even the magicians had boils on their face, and it's showing Moses's dominance over the Egyptian magicians, and that seems to be kind of the main source of what's happening here. And even with Aaron, it starts with Aaron and his staff. So that's the first how we could look at the P source. And he proposes that the E source or the non-P source is kind of a progression of negotiation. With the E source, he sees that as blood, frogs, the insect swarm, the animal plague, the animal epidemic, hail, locusts, and then the death of the firstborn. So that's 8 plagues. The E has 8 plagues. The P has 5 plagues, as we would call them. There's 3 that overlap: blood, frogs, and firstborn. Both sources have those. They're kind of interwoven. But he sees this as a progression of negotiation, where Moses says, "Let my people go," and they negotiate and they negotiate. And as we see as the story progresses, even Pharaoh's officials are like, "Okay, like we're starting to understand Moses and Moses' side. We're starting to understand who this God of the Israelites are, and like we should let them go." And then until the very end, by the final plague that we'll get to at some other point, Pharaoh finally gives in and lets everyone and the animals go. So it's this negotiation between Moses and Pharaoh that eventually Moses wins because of all of the plagues that God provides. So that's how source criticism deals with this to some extent. Does that any of that make sense?
Yeah, I still just want a highlighted version of it to see what people think who each person talking is. And it really, my thing with sources is that it really twists my mind
Mm-hmm.
because I'm like, on one hand, yeah, I get it. Like someone had to stitch these things together. I feel like it was inevitability for all of those works to be laid over each other.
Mm-hmm.
And as looking at this from like a literature standpoint, this is so impressive. This
Yeah.
is so massively impressive. Like, I don't, is the Bible the oldest book
Oh
or
no.
one of?
I mean, it's one of the oldest is um oh my god. I think it's with what's his Gilgamesh. What's Gilgamesh? What's his story
The
called?
Epic of Gilgamesh? That's,
Yeah, yeah, I think
yeah.
Gilgamesh and his story, it has a fancy name and it's not coming to me at the moment. I think that's the oldest with maybe a couple exceptions.
But as one of the oldest living texts, like it was inevitable for it to happen, for it to like be compiled the way it was and for it to get translated. But then I just think about all of these hands that have touched it. I'm having the same feeling I had when we talked about Song of Songs. And you said that it probably went through like a lot of different poets,
Mhm.
like going through it. And I don't know. I just think if I could travel back in time to see anything being made, I think I'd want to watch at one point when the Bible was compiled together.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Because I'm like, were there arguments? Were there people throwing things at each other? Like, no, you can't include that. Were there plagues that were axed? You know,
Okay. So first of all, in oh my goodness, is this Samuel? It would have to be. No, it would be Kings. In the book of Kings, it just kind of shows up like, hey, here's this Bible that we have, that the book of the law. So we'll talk about that at some point. And so the Deuteronomistic history is kind of like, hey, we found this, and we think that's kind of referring to the Torah to some extent. So like it talks about itself in the Bible, which is so interesting.
no, that's crazy.
But if I don't know of any plagues that were axed, but it's kind of odd that we ended up with 10 plagues because we have 8 from one source, supposedly, and 5 from another source, create 10. And then we have other references to the plagues in the Psalms. So we have Psalm 78, and it lists 7 plagues, 8 if you count the parting of the Red Sea, if we count that as a sign. So it has 8. But it mentions 7: blood, insect swarm, frogs, locust, hail, epidemic, and the death of the firstborn. And then we have Psalm 105. That one also only lists 7 plagues. So our external references to the plagues don't mention 10 of them. They mention 7 or 8 at most.
So the Bible's not even consistent within itself.
Yeah, no. So
That's wild.
yeah, there's so much going on with these stories. Like we barely scratched the surface of anything happening. We didn't even get through all 10 plagues. But I think there's just so much happening here, and it's such an exciting, eventful story.
No, I'm excited to talk more about this because it's just one part because then they continue on and they go do other things. And
Yeah,
there's time in the desert and then they climb a mountain.
yeah, multiple times for sure. But yeah, do you have any other last thoughts?
No, I just think I'm realizing this is in fact my favorite Bible story, but I change that
Oh,
answer every time we talk about a different Bible story. So
yeah,
I just love these stories. And I have had a wonderful time chatting with you, Matthew.
yeah.
If you had a good time with us, check us out on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Bluesky, Twitter. I almost called it the other thing. Email Matthew. Guys, he's waiting.
TheReligiousTreehouse@gmail.com.
I'm putting out the call to Al Pacino. So I don't know. That's my white whale. What can I say? But we've had a lovely time talking with you. Come back. Welcome. Yeah. We're the Religious Treehouse. See you later.
Bye.
Bye. My mind just went so blank. So we need to
Ooh.
watch Prince of Egypt next.
Yeah.
And why do you say it like that?
Maybe we get through the Ten Commandments. Isn't that a big deal in the Prince of Egypt? Or do they not even get there?
We see it at the end.
It's at the end?
Yes,
Why would they put the Ten Commandments at the end?
because they happen after they leave.
What's the plot line of the Prince of Egypt?
Moses is in a river.
Yeah,
Moses leads the people out of Egypt. Done.
right.
There you go.
So that's all. It's just them leaving Egypt.
They leave Egypt, then he goes on a mountain and he comes back down with the Ten Commandments, and you get the insinuation of the Ten Commandments. But they don't say the Ten Commandments.
So they don't even make it to the promised land. They don't like. Does
No,
Moses die?
no,
Oh my
no.
goodness.
They just leave Egypt. But it's a whole thing with Whitney Houston singing. There
Fascinating.
can be miracles if
I
you believe.